Smoke curled into the night sky over Merthyr Tydfil, thick and black, carrying the smell of burning furniture and something far worse. It was just after midnight on October 11, 1995, when the first calls came in. Neighbors on the Gurnos Estate shouting that a house was on fire, a woman and two small children trapped inside. By the time firefighters arrived, flames were tearing through the three-bedroom end of terrace house on the hill, lighting up the rows of brick homes that watched in silence. Screams had already faded by then. The heat was too much, the smoke too heavy, and the fire moved with unnatural speed. People who knew the family tried to get close, but the front door was already a furnace. Later, they would learn why the blaze had spread so fast. Petrol had been poured through the letterbox, and in seconds the hallway exploded into flame. Inside that burning home was 21-year-old Diane Jones, and her two daughters, 2-year-old Shauna and 13-month-old Sarah-Jane. A mother and her babies asleep upstairs, unaware that death was creeping through the floorboards. Diane had tucked her girls into bed hours earlier, telling her sister over the phone she'd been tired but happy. It was just another Wednesday night. The family's routine was simple. Diane watched television after putting the girls down, sometimes listening to the quiet hum of the estate outside. But on that night, something or someone was waiting for her. Gurnos Estate in the mid-1990s was a place outsiders rarely understood. Built in the 1970s to provide affordable housing, it had become a sprawling maze of concrete houses, steep roads, and tight lives. For many, it was home. Neighbors looked out for one another, children played football in the cul-de-sacs, but it was also a place where trouble sometimes found its way in. Diane had grown up there, surrounded by family, people who knew her from school and from the shops on the high street. She wasn't rich, but she was proud. Friends remembered her as warm, quick to laugh, devoted to her daughters. She worked hard to keep things together, and she loved her girls more than anything. When the fire tore through the house, firefighters fought to get inside. The flames had started at the front and moved fast up the stairs, trapping the upper floor. It took nearly an hour before crews could enter safely. What they found would haunt even the most experienced among them. Diane and her daughters were huddled together in a back bedroom, as though she'd tried to shield them. The air was thick with soot, and the heat had melted parts of the ceiling. There was no sign of life. The images were so devastating that one responder later said, "You never forget something like that." News of the tragedy spread across the estate before dawn. Mothers wept in their doorways, children asked where Shauna and Sarah-Jane had gone. By morning, police had sealed off the street with blue and white tape, and a mobile incident van was parked outside the charred remains of the house. Reporters arrived soon after, their cameras trained on the blackened windows. At first, everyone assumed it was a terrible accident, a faulty heater, maybe, or an electrical spark. But when investigators began examining the hallway, they found clear traces of petrol. Someone had poured an accelerant through the letterbox and lit it. The blast pattern on the floor told the story in terrible clarity. It had been deliberate. That single discovery turned the mood of the community from grief to fear. A mother and two babies had been murdered, and the killer had walked away into the night. No one could understand who would do such a thing. Rumors spread quickly, whispers about arguments, old grudges, and faces seen lurking around. The Gurnos Estate, already battling a reputation for poverty and violence, suddenly became the center of a murder hunt. Detectives from South Wales Police began their work immediately, going door to door, collecting statements, and trying to piece together Diane's final hours. The police confirmed early on that the fire was no accident, and they promised to find whoever was responsible. The local press called it one of the most horrific crimes in the town's history. Hundreds of people attended the funeral. The coffins, small white ones for the children, were carried together, side by side. Family members collapsed in tears. For Diane's relatives, the world had ended in that fire. Investigators looked closely at Diane's circle of friends and acquaintances. She was young, social, sometimes involved in small arguments that came with the rough edges of estate life. Police records show that there had been tension between her and several local women in the weeks before the fire. Petty disputes, jealousy, rumors. Detectives began focusing on those connections. They believed the arson might have been an act of revenge, a way to teach her a lesson. But as the investigation continued, evidence was thin. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no CCTV on the estate at the time. Then came a breakthrough, or what seemed like one. A woman named Donna Clark, a friend of Diane's, came under suspicion. Police also began questioning another woman, Annette Hewins, who lived nearby and was known in the area as outspoken and independent. They were brought in for questioning along with a third woman, Denise Sullivan. Over long interrogations, fragments of stories began to form, some statements contradicting others, some made under pressure. Eventually, detectives convinced themselves they had their culprits. But in the early days, before any charges were filed, the estate was still living in fear. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them go alone. Rumors turned into accusations. Some said they'd heard shouting outside Diane's house that night. Others claimed they'd seen suspicious figures running away. The uncertainty tore through the community, dividing neighbors who'd known each other for decades. In a place where everyone's business was shared, the silence that followed was unusual and heavy. Meanwhile, forensic experts tried to make sense of the evidence from the scene. They found residue of petrol on the doormat and traces near the front step, consistent with fuel being poured through the letterbox. But beyond that, the science of 1995 had limits. DNA analysis was in its infancy, and microscopic trace recovery techniques that exist today were still years away. The crime scene yielded very little that could directly link anyone to the act. Detectives, under pressure to deliver justice, leaned heavily on witness statements and community rumors. Small inconsistencies were treated as leads, hearsay became evidence. By late 1996, after months of mounting suspicion, arrests were made. The local paper called it a breakthrough, promising closure for a grieving family. Few questioned whether the evidence was strong enough to stand. Back then, the Gurnos Estate carried a stigma. Media often portrayed it as a rough, crime-ridden place, an easy target for headlines about drugs and violence. When the fire happened, those stereotypes colored everything. To the outside world, it was easy to believe that someone from that estate was capable of such a thing. The nuance, the humanity, the pain, all of that was lost behind sensational coverage. But on the night of the fire itself, before the trials and the accusations, there had been only one truth: a young mother trying to save her babies. Firefighters recalled that she had clearly tried to block the smoke from reaching them. Some said she must have woken as the flames reached the stairs, gathered the girls in her arms, and retreated to the bedroom, hoping help would come in time. Her final moments were spent fighting for them, trapped by heat and darkness. By the time daylight came on October 12, the charred shell of the house stood as a grim reminder of what had happened. The smell of smoke hung in the air for days. Flowers appeared on the curb, cards written by neighbors who didn't know what else to say. The estate fell quiet, every shadow carrying a question. Someone out there knew the truth, but no one was talking. As detectives worked, family members clung to one another. Diane's sister later told reporters, "We just couldn't believe it. She was so young, the girls were so beautiful. Who could do that?" Police reassured them that they were closing in on the people responsible. But even then, some locals whispered doubts. The investigation felt rushed. Too many things didn't add up. Yet with so few forensic options and a desperate public demanding answers, the case began to narrow onto those three women. Before the arrests, the police had searched several nearby homes, collecting clothing and household items, hoping for a match to any trace from the fire scene. Nothing definitive came back. But the narrative had already formed: jealousy, revenge, and rage. That was the story everyone was told. It would take years before that story began to unravel. In the months that followed, as the case grew larger, the name Diane Jones became known far beyond Merthyr Tydfil. Reporters revisited the estate for anniversary pieces, photographing the blackened brickwork where her home once stood. It became a symbol of tragedy and of the anger that simmered when justice feels just out of reach. For the people who had loved her, none of it made sense. They remembered her as gentle, devoted to her daughters, with no enemies worth killing for. Yet, someone had poured petrol through her door and left her to die. It was too cruel to comprehend. The investigators said they were sure they had found the culprits. They spoke of motive, opportunity, and resentment. But even as the legal wheels began to turn, there were cracks in the foundation. Witness statements changed. Timelines shifted. Some witnesses admitted later that they had been pressured. None of that mattered in those early months. What mattered was the appearance of progress. That winter, Merthyr Tydfil was colder than usual. The estate was blanketed in frost, the fire long extinguished but still burning in memory. For those who walked past the empty lot where Diane's house once stood, the silence was deafening. At night, the glow from the streetlights reflected off the boarded-up windows, and people said it felt like the house was still watching. The case that began with fire would soon ignite another kind of blaze, one inside courtrooms and hearts, where truth and blame would battle for years. For now, though, the official line was simple: justice was coming. And somewhere beyond the hills of South Wales, 3 small coffins lay beneath the earth, waiting for the truth to finally find them. In the months that followed the fire, the police investigation tightened like a noose around a small circle of women from the Gurnos Estate. Detectives were determined to find someone to blame for the deaths of Diane Jones and her daughters, and as weeks turned into months, pressure grew from both the media and the community. The people of Merthyr Tydfil were angry, frightened, and desperate for closure. For the detectives, that meant moving forward with whatever evidence they could hold together, even if the truth was far more complicated. By early 1996, rumors had hardened into accusations. In the absence of strong forensic evidence, gossip became gold. Police interviewed hundreds of people, some more than once, asking about Diane's relationships, her arguments, and her friends. The names of 3 women kept surfacing: Annette Hewins, Donna Clark, and Denise Sullivan. All 3 were local, all knew Diane in some way, and all had been mentioned in connection with small disputes, the kind of tensions that, in the distorted mirror of grief, could be made to look like motive. Annette was 31, a mother of 2, outspoken, quick to defend herself, and unafraid of the police. She'd had a few run-ins before, nothing major, just the kind of petty trouble that comes from living in a place where everyone knows everyone's business. Donna Clark was younger, quieter, struggling with her own problems, and often caught in the middle of other people's feuds. Denise Sullivan was the least involved, a friend of Donna's, known to be impressionable and easily led. To the police, they seemed like a volatile trio. When detectives first brought them in for questioning, they expected simple interviews. Instead, they found themselves walking into a storm of emotion. Annette was furious, insisting she had nothing to do with the fire. Donna broke down repeatedly, frightened and confused. Denise seemed terrified, contradicting herself under pressure. None of them confessed to setting the blaze, but the police interpreted their nerves and inconsistencies as guilt. Long hours in small interview rooms blurred truth and memory. Statements were rewritten, then rewritten again. The investigators built their case on a fragile web of circumstantial evidence. Witnesses claimed they had overheard arguments between Diane and Annette. Someone said they'd seen the women walking near Diane's house earlier that evening. Another claimed to have heard Annette say she'd teach her a lesson. None of it was corroborated. But in the mid-1990s, before body cameras and recorded interrogations were standard, police testimonies carried enormous weight. By the end of that year, the Crown Prosecution Service announced charges. Annette Hewins and Donna Clark were to be tried for arson with intent to endanger life. Denise Sullivan faced a lesser charge, perverting the course of justice. The decision shocked the community. For many on the estate, these were not monsters or strangers, they were neighbors. Some believed the women were innocent. Others said they were troublemakers who'd finally gone too far. The tension was thick enough to feel. The trial began in 1997 at Cardiff Crown Court, drawing reporters from across Wales. Photographers crowded the entrance, their lenses capturing the women as they arrived, heads down, surrounded by police. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy. Every detail of that October night was retold in slow, painful sequence. Fire investigators described how petrol had been poured through the letterbox and ignited. Experts explained the burn patterns, the carbon monoxide levels, the likely time of death. Family members cried quietly as the jury was shown photographs of the charred rooms. Then came the testimonies from the police and local witnesses. One said that Annette had been seen near the Jones home around midnight. Another claimed Donna had confessed after a night of drinking. The defense challenged these accounts, pointing out inconsistencies and lack of physical evidence. No fingerprints, no accelerant traces on their clothing, no DNA. But the emotional weight of the case, a mother and two babies burned alive, overshadowed logic. The jury listened, horrified, as the prosecution painted a picture of petty jealousy turned deadly. Annette's defense attorney argued fiercely that the case was built on gossip and fear. He reminded the court that her supposed confession never existed, that there was no proof she had even been near Diane's house that night. He spoke of how easily people in small communities could be turned against one another under pressure. But his words struggled to break through the narrative the prosecution had built. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Outside the courthouse, reporters stood in the rain, microphones ready. The story had become national news by then, feeding on every detail of the women's lives, their families, their arguments, their faces splashed across front pages. To many readers, they were already guilty. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. The jury found Annette Hewins and Donna Clark guilty of arson with intent to endanger life. Denise Sullivan was convicted of perverting the course of justice. Annette and Donna wept as the judge pronounced their sentences. Annette received life imprisonment, Donna was given a long custodial term. Diane Jones's family cried in the gallery, relieved that justice, at least on paper, had been done. For the public, it seemed like the story had ended. But inside prison, Annette refused to accept that ending. She wrote letters proclaiming her innocence, describing how she had been trapped by lies and assumptions. They needed someone to blame, she wrote in one, and I was the easiest target. She appealed her conviction, but it took nearly 2 years for her case to reach the Court of Appeal. During that time, her health deteriorated. She missed her children, she suffered from anxiety, and she felt the weight of being branded a child killer. Donna, too, struggled inside, withdrawn, frightened, confused about how everything had spiraled so quickly. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, journalists and campaigners began taking notice. Something about the case didn't sit right. Legal experts pointed out how little hard evidence there had been. Forensic scientists questioned whether the supposed traces of accelerant were ever properly verified. The community was divided, but a small group of supporters began organizing around Annette's cause, arguing that she'd been wrongly convicted. In February 1999, after years of waiting, the Court of Appeal finally reviewed her case. The hearing was brief but devastating to the original prosecution. Judges ruled that the evidence against Annette had been wholly insufficient and that her conviction was unsafe. Donna Clark's conviction was also overturned shortly afterward. Denise Sullivan's conviction for perverting the course of justice was quashed as well. Annette walked free that winter, stepping into cold sunlight after nearly 3 years behind bars. Cameras were waiting, journalists shouting questions. Her face looked older, tired, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I didn't do it. I told them from the beginning, and nobody listened. The same papers that had once called her a killer now called her a victim of injustice. But the damage was deep. The time she'd lost, the trauma she carried, none of that could be undone. Even after the acquittals, the mystery of who had set the fire remained. Police quietly admitted that the trail had gone cold. Without new evidence, there was nothing left to pursue. The case was officially unsolved. For Diane's family, the reversal of the convictions was confusing and painful. They had believed that justice had been served, now they were back to the beginning. For Annette and Donna, freedom didn't erase the years of being labeled murderers. Annette returned to the Gurnos Estate for a time, but she found it hard to live among people who still whispered. Some welcomed her home, others avoided her. She became a symbol of the system's failure, both for those who believed she was innocent and those who didn't know what to believe anymore. In the early 2000s, documentaries revisited the case. Legal scholars cited it as an example of how social bias and weak evidence could lead to wrongful convictions. Annette participated in interviews, speaking about her time in prison and her struggle to rebuild her life. They stole years from me, she said in one. But I still think about that poor woman and her children. Somebody did that to them. And it wasn't me. By then, forensic science had advanced dramatically. DNA profiling, accelerant detection, and trace analysis were far more precise than in 1995. But the physical evidence from Diane's house had long been compromised, degraded, lost, or destroyed after the trial. Still, investigators occasionally revisited the file, unable to let go of such a brutal case. The South Wales Police Major Crime Review Unit kept it in their archive of unresolved homicides, waiting for the right moment to reopen it. As years passed, time softened nothing. The Jones family continued to grieve, holding memorials each October, lighting candles for Diane, Shauna, and Sarah-Jane. They avoided the subject of the trial when they could. For them, the wounds had never healed, only scarred over. The Gurnos Estate moved on. In some ways new families moved in, old homes were refurbished, but the fire became part of its story, whispered in pubs and remembered by the older residents. Then in 2012, tragedy struck again. Annette Hewins, who had spent years fighting to clear her name, died unexpectedly at age 43. Those who knew her said she never fully recovered from her wrongful conviction. Her death was reported quietly, with brief mentions of the fire that had defined her life. Friends said she still talked about it, even in her final days, about how justice had never truly been done, and how she hoped someone, someday, would find the truth. In the years that followed, the case drifted into the background of Welsh true crime history, remembered mainly by locals and legal scholars. But the families never stopped asking questions. Diane's relatives continued to press police for updates, hoping that new technology might bring answers. They spoke to reporters on anniversaries, each time a little older, each time still searching. By the mid-2020s, advances in forensic science had reached levels that detectives in the 1990s could only dream of. Cold cases across the UK were being reopened with new DNA techniques, and South Wales police began systematically reviewing unsolved murders from the past 50 years. The fire on the Gurnos estate was near the top of that list. 30 years had passed since that terrible night, and still no one had been held accountable. In 2025, the Major Crime Review Unit confirmed they were launching a forensic re-examination of the Diane Jones case. They announced they would retest every remaining piece of evidence, from charred debris to clothing samples, using modern forensic techniques that could detect microscopic traces of DNA, accelerant, or material transfer. It was a long shot but a real one. Detectives also issued a renewed public appeal, urging anyone who might still hold information to come forward. For the first time in decades, hope stirred again on the Gurnos estate. Old wounds reopened, but with them came the faint promise of closure. Diane's surviving family members said the news was bittersweet. "We've waited 30 years, her sister told ITV in an interview. It's been a nightmare that never ended. Maybe now we'll finally know." The announcement brought the story back into the headlines, this time framed not as scandal or tragedy, but as unfinished justice. Reporters revisited the case, reminding readers of the fire that killed a young mother and her babies, the wrongful convictions that followed, and the decades of unanswered questions. Some who had lived on the estate back then agreed to speak publicly for the first time, describing the fear that gripped the community and the feeling that the wrong people had been punished. Among them were those who remembered Diane not as a case, but as a person, a girl who had grown up among them, who laughed easily, who had two beautiful little daughters with bright eyes and soft curls. They remembered the smell of the fire that night, the way the sky glowed orange, and how everything felt different afterward. As the review began, detectives sifted through boxes of old evidence. Some materials were missing, some degraded beyond use, but they still found items that could be re-examined. The hope was that modern technology might succeed where 1990s methods had failed, that even the smallest trace could point toward a name. No one knows yet if the truth will emerge. But as of late 2025, the investigation continues quietly, behind the doors of forensic labs and police offices. The flames that consumed Diane's home 3 decades ago may have burned away much of the physical evidence, but they left behind questions that refused to die. What drove someone to pour petrol through that letterbox on a quiet October night? Why Diane? Why her children? And what kind of hatred could ignite such horror and then walk away into the darkness, untouched for 30 years? For Merthyr Tydfil, and for all of South Wales, Those questions still hang in the air unanswered, but not forgotten. The autumn of 2025 arrived with the same chill that had hung over Merthyr Tydfil 3 decades earlier. The Gurnos Estate looked different now. Some of the old blocks had been torn down, streets renamed, and new families moved in. But for those who remembered that October night in 1995, the ghosts never left. For them, the air still carried the weight of that fire, and the name Diane Jones still stirred something deep and painful. When news broke that police had reopened the case, it didn't just bring curiosity, it brought everything back: the smoke, the fear, and the grief that had sunk into the town's bones. The South Wales Police Major Crime Review Unit began their re-examination quietly. They didn't want spectacle or false hope. They started by cataloging what little physical evidence still existed: pieces of burnt carpet sealed in plastic, sections of melted metal from the doorframe, and small samples of residue scraped from the hallway where the accelerant had been poured. Every item was handled like a fragile thread to the past. Modern laboratories could now detect microscopic DNA cells from sweat or skin that 1990s technology would have missed completely. Even trace amounts of fuel could be chemically broken down to reveal its exact composition, perhaps even where it was purchased. For investigators, it was like peering into a long-closed time capsule. Old notes written in fading ink were scanned and digitized. Witness statements were retyped, their contradictions highlighted by modern analysts. Detectives who had been young constables at the time were interviewed again, their memories recorded for historical accuracy. The idea wasn't only to find a new suspect, it was also to understand how the investigation had gone so wrong in the first place. The review came at a moment when the public appetite for cold case justice was strong. Across the UK, decades-old crimes were being solved through advanced DNA databases and new digital forensics. Families who had waited lifetimes were finally getting answers. For Diane's family, hope was fragile but alive. Her surviving sister, now in her 50s, told a local reporter, "It's been 30 years, but we still talk about her every day. When I close my eyes, I see her holding those girls. Maybe this time the truth will come out." But hope came with pain. Each new headline reopened old wounds. For many on the Gurnos, the fire had been more than a crime, it had been a turning point. The estate had never quite shaken the stigma it gained after the tragedy. Some older residents remembered how outsiders had looked down on them, calling the place rough or lawless. "We weren't monsters," one man said in an interview. "We were just poor." But after that fire, they talked about us like animals. The wrongful convictions of Annette Hewins and Donna Clark had only deepened that resentment. Annette's story, too, resurfaced in the public memory as journalists revisited the case. She had died in 2012, never seeing full vindication or apology. Her children, now adults, spoke of how their mother's life had been destroyed by the accusation. She wanted justice for Diane, her son said, but she wanted justice for herself too. "People forget what it's like to be blamed for something you didn't do." The reopening of the case felt like a strange kind of vindication, not because it erased the past, but because it finally admitted that the story wasn't over. In the police review office, detectives pored over new lab reports. Some materials were too degraded to test, but there were hints, faint chemical traces that might reveal what type of accelerant had been used, or whether it had been carried in a plastic container or glass bottle. These details could narrow down the suspect's methods, maybe even match other unsolved arson attempts in South Wales from the same era. The review team also re-examined witness reports from 1995, mapping timelines and statements on digital overlays. Patterns emerged that had been overlooked before. One of the strangest things about the case was how quickly it had been declared solved back then. Within months, detectives had focused entirely on Annette and her friends, effectively closing off other leads. New analysts noted that several early witness reports mentioned a car speeding away from the scene shortly after the fire started, details that were never fully followed up. Another resident recalled hearing male voices outside the house that night, not female ones. Those small inconsistencies might have been dismissed at the time, but in hindsight, they glowed like warning lights. The review team decided to track down surviving witnesses. Some were still living on the estate, others had moved away. When detectives knocked on doors in 2025, they found people willing to talk in ways they hadn't before. Age, distance, and time had softened fear. A few said they always doubted the women's guilt but were afraid to speak against the police back then. One man said quietly, "Everybody knew they got the wrong people. But who were we to say anything? We were just estate folk. Nobody listened to us." That silence, born of fear and mistrust, had allowed the real killer to vanish into history. The new investigation aimed to break that silence once and for all. Detectives issued fresh appeals through ITV and local Welsh news, asking anyone with knowledge of that night to come forward, no matter how small the detail. The appeal carried the faces of Diane, Shauna, and Sarah-Jane, smiling in grainy family photos. The response was slow but steady. Tips began to arrive, some anonymous, some heartfelt. Among the letters and emails were memories, tiny fragments of that October night. A retired firefighter wrote that he had always suspected more than one person was involved. A woman who had lived on a nearby street said she'd heard a knock on her door just before midnight, but when she opened it, no one was there. Every story added another piece to a puzzle that had been scattered for 30 years. The case also forced South Wales Police to confront its own past. In recent years, the force had faced criticism for several wrongful convictions from the 1980s and 1990s. The Diane Jones investigation was part of that legacy. Senior officers publicly admitted that the early inquiry might have been compromised by tunnel vision and social bias. The new review, they said, was not only about solving a crime, it was about learning from history. For the Jones family, that acknowledgement meant more than they expected. For years, they'd felt caught between grief for Diane and guilt over the women who had been wrongly accused. "We believed what they told us," Diane's cousin said softly. "When they arrested those women, we thought it was over. Then it wasn't. And now we're back to not knowing anything. It's like we've lived the same nightmare twice." At night, the Gurnos Estate was quiet again. The streets were lined with new houses, clean facades where burned brick once stood. But there were still corners that carried memories: an empty patch of grass where children once left flowers, a lamppost where police tape had fluttered in the wind. The past lingered in those spaces, whispering that the truth was still out there. The renewed investigation didn't promise miracles, but it brought dignity back to the story. It reframed Diane Jones not as a headline, but as a young mother who never got to see her children grow. It reminded the public that behind every cold case are real people, living with questions that time cannot erase. By late 2025, forensic results from the new tests were still pending. Detectives refused to speculate, but one quietly told a journalist that they were cautiously optimistic. Advances in trace DNA might reveal something microscopic but meaningful, a clue linking an unknown person to that door, that hallway, that match. Even the smallest discovery could shift everything. Whatever the outcome, the review had already changed how people remembered the case. For 30 years, the story had been about guilt, blame, and scandal. Now it was about endurance, memory, and truth. It was about a family who refused to stop asking, a community that carried its pain in silence, and a justice system finally willing to look back. As winter crept across South Wales, the hills around Merthyr turned white with frost. Candles once again flickered at a small memorial for Diane and her daughters. A few neighbors gathered there, some too young to remember the fire, others old enough to have lived through every second of it. They bowed their heads as the wind moved through the trees. 30 years ago, a mother tried to protect her babies from a wall of fire. The world moved on, but the echo of her final moments never faded. Somewhere, someone still knows what happened that night: the footsteps, the sound of liquid splashing, the spark that changed everything. And until that truth comes to light, the story of Diane Jones will remain what it has always been, a question burning quietly in the dark, waiting for justice that has taken far too long to arrive.